In this video, we'll look at how the Civil War continued in 1864. Where we last left off in late 1863, Grant's Union Army of the Tennessee had just taken eastern Tennessee, had won at Chattanooga, and Lincoln had made him the overall commander of Union forces in the East and the West and ordered him back to Washington. Well, the first significant decision Grant made was for the Union forces in Tennessee to march southeastward, taking Atlanta and ultimately heading to the ocean, cutting off the upper South from the lower South. Throughout the remainder of the war, there remained some fighting in parts of Tennessee, the Confederates led by General John Bell Hood, who you can see on the left here. There was also continued fighting in Texas. Mostly, however, the remainder of the war saw the major fighting in the east. To lead the Union Army of Tennessee from Tennessee to Atlanta and ultimately to the ocean, Grant chose William Tecumseh Sherman, shown here. Sherman had worked for Grant since the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862 and shared Grant's aggressive strategy. He also believed that a march straight through the heart of the South would completely demoralize the Southerners and make them realize that further resistance was futile. Sherman got to work immediately and marched steadily towards Atlanta, which fell in September 1864. Sherman ordered all the civilians out of the city and then proceeded to shell it with these huge mortars you see here. If you've ever seen the old movie Gone with the Wind, you might think of what Atlanta was like. The city was completely destroyed, as you can see in this famous photograph. Here's another picture of Atlanta destroyed. You can see the train roundabout was completely destroyed. By November, Sherman was ready to begin his march to the sea, and this march went on for a little more than a month. His march to the sea is going to become famous, or if you're from the South, it's going to be infamous to the Southerners. His forces, Sherman's forces, had numbered about 60,000 men, and the Confederates just simply didn't have enough forces to match it. Here you can see a long wagon train passing through a city. Someone set up a camera and took a photograph. Sherman's forces cut a 60-mile wide swath across eastern Georgia. They destroyed everything they found: railroads, buildings, even all the food they couldn't eat themselves. And there was even a lot of looting and pillaging as well. Here's another photograph of Sherman's march to the sea. Sherman said, quote, "Whip the rebels to humble their pride, to follow them to their innermost recesses, and make them fear and dread us," unquote. What Sherman recognized was that the Southerners were the enemy. And 19th century warfare is kind of chivalrous. You don't attack women and children. There are rules to warfare, and you don't attack the civilians. But Sherman is kind of looking at warfare from a 20th century viewpoint. The idea that it's kind of all's fair in love and war. And so you attack, as you attack the army, you also demoralize and hurt the civilians who in effect support the army. And that's why the march to the sea was in the South seen as so barbarous. In actuality, few civilians actually died, but there was definitely, because they fled, but there's definitely a lot of property destruction. They tear up the railroads, burn crops and everything. When they got to Savannah in December 1864, there was some fighting, but the Confederates eventually evacuated the city, and the Sherman's troops occupied it, which you can see here. Sherman was then, after occupying Savannah, ordered to start advancing northward. The idea was that he'd cut the South, sort of north and south, and you can see his passage in this map. And then by heading north, he'd come to reinforce Grant, who in this time and throughout 1864 had been fighting Lee. And that's where we're going to turn now, which is going on simultaneously. As Sherman advanced to the sea in his famous march to the sea throughout 1864, Grant assumed command of the Union Army of the Potomac in northern Virginia. Grant's Army of the Potomac now had about 115,000 men, which greatly outnumbered Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, which had been fighting for so long. Grant planned just to continue to attack, pushing slowly towards Richmond. But the main goal was just to start depleting Lee's forces. If he just continued a relentless attack, Lee could not replenish his losses. The first battle came in May 1864 in northern Virginia, very near where the Battle of Chancellorsville had been the previous year. The horrible bloodletting of this battle became known as the Battle of Wilderness in May 1864. Grant, by the way, while commander-in-chief of all the Union forces, decided to advance with the Army of Northern Virginia. He didn't want to be a desk general like Halleck had been, and Lincoln let him do so, informed, convinced that there was enough troops left in Washington to defend it. There's also the matter of the telegraph. Grant could keep Lincoln and the War Department completely informed with the use of telegraph. Anyway, the Battle of Wilderness is going to be the first big battle between the war's two top generals. Everybody wanted to see how Grant, who was now famous from the East, would stand up against the famous Lee, who now had a real reputation. Lee dug trenches in a well-defended line, and the battle raged in the thicket of forest, which, of course, is what gave the battle its name. Here you can see some pictures of the battlefield or the area around it immediately after the fight. The fighting ignited fires that burned many soldiers alive. Even today, the death toll seems uncertain. The best estimates of the dead being about 20,000 Union troops and 11,000 Confederates. So, the Lee's kind of, in a sense, won that battle. But like I say, Grant is not going to retreat and replenish his soldiers. He's just going to keep attacking. And so while Lee had lost 11,000 men, that's 11,000 men he's not going to have when Grant immediately turns and attacks. Here's another picture taken after the battle. You can note the skull of the dead soldier in the thicket of the Wilderness. Grant withdrew slightly, which again kind of says that the Battle of the Wilderness was a Lee victory. But he didn't retreat back to Washington. He was planning his next move. And what he did was he dispatched a cavalry general, Philip Sheridan, shown here, would swing around the side and advance on Richmond. And the idea was that, Sheridan only had a force of 12,000, but what he would do is cut the supply lines of Lee's army. And but the trouble was Lee had anticipated such a maneuver and sent some of his troops to protect the sweep across, below where his troops were, keeping them connected to the supplies he needed. The resulting battle was won by the Confederates, and thus, like I say, Lee's supply lines were kept open. The fighting did, however, cost one of the famous Confederate generals his life. J.E.B. Stuart, Jeb Stuart, died. And James Ewell Brown Stuart, that's his full name, had once famously said, I'd rather die than be whipped. And in fighting Sheridan, indeed, he did die. After a briefly withdrawing, Grant again advanced, and he pushed Lee back to not far from the Wilderness spot, but Spotsylvania Courthouse. So a couple weeks later, in May 8th to 20, there's going to be another big battle, the Battle of the Spotsylvania Courthouse. Once again, Lee put a well-defined defense up, and Grant just attacked. You can see that the picture of the Spotsylvania Courthouse, and I put a little arrow where it was located within the Confederate perimeter. Grant's attack was relentless, and the Confederates lost another 10,000 men, and they lost 8 generals, while Grant lost 18,000 men and 5 generals. Here's a picture of one of the dead at Spotsylvania Courthouse. Once again, Grant kind of withdrew a little bit. And so once again, the Union Army lost twice as many people. You could say the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse was a Union loss, another victory for Lee. But Grant was just getting ready to continue to attack, and he was just continuing to drain Lee's army. Lee's army withdrew, meanwhile, to Cold Harbor, a small hamlet just 10 miles northeast of Richmond. And there, once again, he set up a strong defense, which seemed to some of Grant's men impenetrable. Some spent the night before the attack sewing their names into uniforms so their bodies could be identified. The Battle of Cold Harbor was only about a week after the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse or so. And so, yet again, it's relentless, and once again, it was a bloodbath. During the fighting, Lee suggested a temporary truce to withdraw some of the dead from the battlefield, but Grant refused. Again, he's not giving Lee a second to replenish. Here's an interesting picture. It's a picture of Grant bending here. I pointed out him with the arrow. They'd taken pews out of a church during the Battle of Cold Harbor, and he is conferring over a map with some of his other officers. It's interesting because you look on the right there's a guy with a pipe who's turned and looking at the cameraman. Where it's blurred is where, of course, people were moving. The Battle of Cold Harbor took place from June 1 to 4, 1864, and as I said, it was a bloodbath. Grant lost 7,000 men, and Lee lost 1,500. By the end of Cold Harbor, Grant hadn't been able to take Richmond. He hadn't even been able to defeat Lee's army, but he continually pushed Lee backwards, and they were very near Richmond. Grant had lost 60,000 men by this point, almost double what Lee had lost. Lee had lost about 30,000. Grant was known to his men as the Butcher, who believed that his strategy was unnecessary. They just buried the dead where they were, and soon thereafter they dug them up and buried them in proper burial, and that's what you see in this picture here. It's kind of nasty. You can see a soldier's leg still with its boot on sticking out of his skeleton. While Grant was painfully edging closer and closer to Richmond, and I might add, again, Sherman was taking Atlanta and was pushing on his march to the sea, going on at the same time, Lee was getting reinforcements from the Shenandoah Valley. In the valley, therefore, the Union felt like they had to get in and disrupt that supply line. And so Grant sent Union General David Hunter to sort of down the valley to cut some of the supplies that were supplying Lee's army. Here you can see the path they took. He did not have a large force, but you can see a picture of General David Hunter right here. Again, they had a number of battles, smaller sized battles. When they reached Lexington, Virginia, there were two colleges. There was the Virginia Military Institute and Washington College. What Hunter did was the Virginia Military Institute had supplied troops. Well, if you count 15, 16, 17-year-old kids as troops in the defenses. So what he did was he shelled VMI, and of course VMI is still a college today. Here you can see a picture of the barracks of VMI just after the shelling. Washington College was just next door, and he went over and he was getting ready to shell Washington College, but somebody pointed out that there was a statue of Washington atop the main building, and so he didn't fire. And that building at Washington College is still standing today. It wasn't burned. And by the way, after the war, Robert E. Lee is going to return to the presidency of Washington College, and it's going to be renamed Washington and Lee University, which is where I went to school. Hunter was causing such havoc that Lee felt like he had to stop it. And so he took some of the forces that were surrounding Richmond and sent them into the valley to drive Hunter out. And this fighting was taking place about the time of Cold Harbor, I might add, to just keep chronology straight. But the Confederate forces did indeed drive Hunter out of the valley and into West Virginia. With Hunter pushed into West Virginia, Lee then ordered his troops in the Shenandoah Valley, this time he's going to put them under General Jubal Early, shown here, to move north in the valley and raid Washington. Of course, so many Union troops were deployed around Richmond. Like David Hunter, Jubal Early had a relatively small force, and he was able to move quickly, but he advanced up and got to the edge of Washington. He actually got within what's within the the city of, the District of Columbia today, there were a number of forts surrounding Washington, the District of Columbia. Shown here are the forts, one of the forts, Fort Stevens. If you're familiar with Washington, one of the metro stops is Fort Totten, and you can parts of Washington and near where I used to live when I lived in Washington, you can see parts of the trenches that were still there. Interestingly, Lincoln went out to some of these forts to inspect the defenses and was standing. Of course, he was a tall guy, and one of the soldiers didn't realize who it was. And I guess he was in range of Confederate snipers, and the guy said, "Get down, you damn fool," at the President of the United States. Juba Early's forces didn't obviously take Washington. They simply didn't have enough men, so they withdrew. Grant, meanwhile, after the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, decided to try to continue his flanking maneuver and cut south of Richmond. This meant he had to cross the James River. And of course, Lee followed him, and they ended up south of Richmond in the town of Petersburg. The reason Lee wanted to defend Petersburg was because, obviously he left troops around Richmond, but the reason he wanted to defend Petersburg was because Petersburg was a railroad hub. And if Petersburg were to fall, then Richmond could be sieged. And so that would be something that would make Richmond fall regardless. Here you see a picture of Petersburg before the fighting. Lee really dug in his forces around Petersburg. I was talking about the advance in warfare, with better technology, better guns and stuff. In the earlier 19th century, battles were often fluid. There were more flanking maneuvers, and there'd be a lot of chaos because you had to get kind of close to people to see them to shoot. But with better technology, you could kill them from further away with artillery and so forth. And so what you're seeing is a less mobile fighting, and both sides are beginning to dig pretty significant trenches. And so Lee began to dig in incredible trenches around Petersburg. And if you're familiar, 40 years later, of course, it was trenches you think of with World War I. So this is kind of the beginning of a new type of warfare. Again, here you see some pictures of the Confederate trenches in front of Petersburg. Another picture of these trenches. It's just going to be very difficult to drive them out of these trenches. So what Grant decided to do was, sort of build it himself and lay siege on the city, just kind of surround it the best he can, shell it, and eventually, Lee would lose so many men and it wouldn't have supplies that the city would have to fall. If you recall, it's kind of what he did with Vicksburg. And so in August 1864, the siege is going to begin, and it's really going to continue into 1865, which is the next video. Shown here are some Union troops outside Petersburg during the siege. Obviously, the officers in the back standing on the ridge are posing, because if they were anywhere near a battle, they wouldn't be standing up like that. By August 1864, of course, the impending 1864 U.S. elections was about to take place, and Lincoln was worried about a re-election. Lincoln, of course, sought re-election in 1864, and what he wanted to do was emphasize the peace that would need to follow. So what he did was he picked a new vice presidential running mate. He selected Tennessee Senator Andrew Johnson, and you can see him here. Johnson had been in the Tennessee House and had been in the U.S. Senate, U.S. House and U.S. Senate. He was a Northern Democrat, but he was a loyalist. He stayed with the Union, but he was one of those Northern Democrats that they wanted to end the war, and he wasn't really concerned about the status of the African Americans at all. And by Lincoln, selecting him, it was kind of indicating that Lincoln wouldn't be overly harsh on the South after the war. Undoubtedly, Lincoln's decision was to help take away that fighting spirit in the South. Johnson, by the way, might also help capture Northern Democratic support in the election. I'm assuming that was also part of Lincoln's consideration. So Lincoln's Republican efforts kind of called themselves the National Union ticket. We're going to get the Union back together. But a growing number of Republicans were displeased with Lincoln because he'd yet to come out forcibly for a new constitutional amendment abolishing slavery everywhere and for all time. Remember, he'd issued the Emancipation Emancipation Proclamation, but that had only freed slaves in areas then in rebellion. There were a lot of slaves in border states and areas not in rebellion, and they hadn't been freed. And so a lot of abolitionists and others were saying, gosh, dog, we have to end slavery once and for all. Because of this, John C. Fremont, and you can see him to the right here, who had been the Republican candidate in 1856, the first national Republican Party candidate, he had considered challenging Lincoln for the Republican nomination, saying that Lincoln hadn't gone far enough. When, however, Lincoln came out for the new constitutional amendment outlawing and abolishing slavery forever and everywhere, and he began to campaign on it, Fremont agreed not to run, and Lincoln had the Republican nomination assured. The Northern Democrats chose General George B. McClellan, and you can see one of his flyers here. McClellan, of course, was the Union general that Lincoln had relieved actually a couple times, and I don't doubt that he was kind of resentful against Lincoln. As I said, he had a huge ego. The Democratic platform was pretty much what it had been throughout the war. It was calling for an immediate ceasefire and then a peace conference that would, kind of go for negotiations. The thing was, it seemed like a useless surrender at this point. People could see that the Union forces were about to win. So Lincoln was an overwhelming favorite in the general campaign against McClellan. Here's a cartoon, showing Lincoln's dominance. Lincoln kind of laughing at the small McClellan. In the end, Lincoln won just over 2,200,000 popular votes, or 55% of the popular vote, to McClellan's 1,800,000, or 45%. In the Electoral College, it was even more of a landslide, 212 to 21. While Lincoln won re-election, the campaign had exposed a growing rift over, sort of how to handle Reconstruction, how hard or soft to be on South after the war, how the South should re-enter. Lincoln, of course, is going to be assassinated, but had he lived, he probably would have had to deal with this. Here you can see the electoral map of the election of 1864 and a newspaper article announcing Lincoln's election. This concludes the video on the fighting in 1864.